1980s, a neurologist named Francisco Lopera began receiving reports from a remote region of the Antioquia province in Colombia. Families were describing something that at first seemed impossible. Entire branches of extended families were losing their memories, not in old age, not after strokes or injuries. People in their 40s and even their 30s were forgetting where they lived, forgetting the names of their children, forgetting who they were. And it was happening generation after generation, following bloodlines through mountain villages like a curse nobody could explain. When Lopera traveled into those mountains and began meeting these families, he encountered something that no medical researcher had ever documented at this scale. He had found the largest single family in recorded history, carrying a genetic mutation that causes Alzheimer's disease with near certainty, decades before the age when most people ever develop it. Hundreds of people, all descended from a common ancestor, all carrying the same single letter of genetic code that was quietly dismantling their minds from the inside. What this Colombian family revealed about memory, identity, and the biology of the self would take decades to fully understand. And the answers they provided are still reshaping everything medicine thought it knew about one of the most devastating conditions on Earth. To understand what Lopera found in those mountains, you first need to understand what Alzheimer's disease actually is at the biological level, because most people carry a fundamentally incomplete picture of it. Alzheimer's is not simply forgetting things. Forgetting things is a symptom. The disease itself is a physical process happening inside the brain tissue. Two specific structures build up inside the brain of every Alzheimer's patient: amyloid plaques, dense clusters of a misfolded protein called beta amyloid that accumulate between neurons and disrupt communication between them, and tau tangles, twisted fibers of another protein that build up inside neurons themselves, eventually killing them entirely. The brain does not lose memories randomly. It loses them in a specific sequence that follows the physical spread of tau tangles through brain tissue. The hippocampus, the region most critical for forming new memories, is typically attacked first. This is why early Alzheimer's patients can describe their childhood in vivid detail, but cannot remember what they ate for breakfast. Old memories are stored across wide networks throughout the brain. New ones depend on a hippocampus that is already under assault. As tangles spread outward from the hippocampus into surrounding regions, language begins to slip. Then spatial reasoning. Then the recognition of faces. Then the recognition of voices. Alzheimer's does not just erase memories. It systematically dismantles the entire architecture of a self, working inward from the edges until nothing remains. The Colombian family Lopera discovered carried a mutation in a gene called PSEN1. Presenilin-1. This mutation causes the brain to produce abnormal amounts of beta amyloid beginning in early adulthood. By the time carriers reach their mid-40s, their brains are already heavily loaded with plaques. Symptoms typically begin around age 44. Full dementia follows within a decade. Almost no carrier escapes it. What made this family scientifically extraordinary was not just the mutation itself. Similar mutations had been found in smaller families elsewhere. What made them extraordinary was the size of the affected group and their willingness to participate in research. Lopera eventually identified over 6,000 living members of this extended family network. Of those, roughly 1,200 carried the PSEN1 mutation. They were a ready-made longitudinal study, a population large enough to draw statistically meaningful conclusions, willing to be scanned and tested and followed across decades. They became the most studied family in the history of Alzheimer's research, and the data they provided cracked open questions that had been locked for decades. The first major revelation was about time, specifically how early the disease actually begins. Using brain imaging technology that could detect amyloid plaques directly, researchers scanning young adult carriers found plaques beginning to accumulate in their 20s, sometimes their late teens, a full 2 decades before any symptom appeared. The brain was already changing, already being altered, long before any memory slipped or any name was forgotten. This reframed everything. Alzheimer's had always been conceived as a disease of the elderly because that is when symptoms appear. But symptoms are late. Symptoms are what you see after the disease has been running for 20 years. The actual disease, the biological process, begins in relative youth for these carriers, and likely begins earlier than anyone suspected in the general population as well. This has enormous implications. Every treatment trial ever run for Alzheimer's had recruited patients who already had symptoms, patients whose brains had already lost significant tissue and function. Researchers were trying to stop a fire that had been burning for 2 decades. The Colombian family demonstrated clearly that the window for effective intervention was not at the point of symptoms. It was years, possibly decades, earlier. Then came the case that stopped the entire field in its tracks. Among the thousands of Colombian carriers being followed by Lopera's team, one woman stood out. She carried the PSEN1 mutation. Her brain scans showed amyloid plaque levels that were among the highest ever recorded in a living patient, far higher than would normally be associated with any cognitive function at all. By every biological measure, her brain should have been devastated. She did not develop significant symptoms until her 70s, 3 decades later than every other carrier in her family. 3 decades during which she remained largely cognitively intact while her siblings and cousins with the same mutation lost themselves completely. When researchers analyzed her genetics in detail, they found a second mutation, one she had not been looking for and had not known she carried. A variant in a gene called APE, specifically a rare form called the Christchurch variant, present in both copies of her APA gene. This variant appeared to be protecting her brain despite the catastrophic amyloid burden it was carrying, not by preventing plaques from forming. The plaques were there in abundance, but by somehow blocking the downstream cascade of tau tangles that plaques normally trigger, and by preserving the function of neurons even in an environment saturated with amyloid. Her case suggested something the field had not fully accepted. Amyloid plaques alone may not be sufficient to cause the disease, and somewhere in that complexity lies a vulnerability that can, under the right circumstances, be blocked. She became one of the most studied individuals in the history of neuroscience. Her biology is still being analyzed. The protective mechanism her APE variant provided is now the basis of multiple drug development programs attempting to replicate its effect artificially. Beyond the pure science, the Colombian families raised questions that medicine rarely asks directly. Questions about identity, personhood, and what memory actually is in the context of a human life. Families who watched relatives progress through Alzheimer's described a specific and particularly painful experience. Their loved one was physically present. They could still laugh, still respond to touch, still show emotion. But the person who knew their shared history, who remembered the events and experiences that defined the relationship, was gone. Caregivers consistently described feeling as though they were grieving someone who had not yet died. This forced a question that philosophers have debated for centuries, but that these families were living through practically. Is a person their memories? The sequence of experiences and relationships and choices that a person can recall and reflect upon. What remains? Is the laughing still the same individual who raised children and built a career and made promises decades earlier? Or has something essential ended while biology continues? There is no clean answer, but the Colombian families gave this abstract philosophical debate a human face and an urgent medical dimension. Understanding what is lost in Alzheimer's required understanding what memory actually contributes to selfhood, and that question pushed neuroscience into territory it had previously left to philosophy. Research born from Lopera's work in those Colombian mountains has now produced the first prevention trials ever conducted for Alzheimer's disease. Studies giving experimental drugs to cognitively healthy carriers of the PSEN1 mutation years before any symptom appears, attempting to slow or stop the biological process before it reaches the point of no return. Results have been mixed and the field is still evolving rapidly, but the trials exist because of those families. The entire concept of treating Alzheimer's as a preventable condition rather than an inevitable consequence of aging exists in large part because a neurologist traveled into remote mountains in Colombia in the 1980s and listened to families describe a curse that turned out to be a gene. The village where everyone forgot who they were was not a place of tragedy only. It became, over 4 decades of research, one of the most important places in the history of brain science. The families who participated, who allowed themselves to be scanned and tested, and followed across their entire adult lives knowing what was coming for many of them, contributed something that cannot be fully measured. They gave medicine a window into a disease that had been studied only at its end. They revealed that the story of Alzheimer's begins decades before anyone notices it. They produced a single, extraordinary woman whose biology may eventually protect millions of people who will never know her name. And they asked, simply by living through what they lived through, the question that sits underneath all of it. Who are we when the memories go? What remains when the story of a self can no longer be told by the self that lived it? Science is still working on the answer. But because of those families in the Colombian mountains, it is closer than it has ever been.